Welcome back to part two of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We're still recording on a beautiful Wednesday morning. Once a month, we teach a class called Race Class. And we started doing this 4 years ago. It still amazes me that this was my inspiration, and Jonathan Feingold, the law professor at BU, has held my hand ever since. And we've been doing it for a long time. And we took a hiatus last month, but let me remind you about Race Class. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU law professor Jonathan Feingold and myself are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And as you described the functional purpose of Race Class, you noted, Jonathan, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Let me welcome you back to the program. Thank you for doing this, Professor Feingold.
Thanks, Arnie. It's nice to be here. It's been, feels like it's been a long time since we last chatted, and it
Well,
was,
we weren't at war last time we talked. All
at
right,
least not
okay?
this one.
Not this one. That's right. That's it. A couple of others, but not this one. As I keep telling everyone that the problem with Donald Trump is that he thought that Iran was Venezuela that spoke Farsi. It was like he has no clue to what he's doing, and it's getting more dangerous by the hour. Despite what he keeps saying, which is, I want it over, and of course Netanyahu doesn't want it over. So the question is, what happens when one party who's dropping bombs says, "I want to keep dropping for another couple of weeks. We're only at the halfway point." But when I talked to you, I said, "What do you want to talk about?" And you mentioned that you wanted to talk about segregation. And when I hear that word, the first thing that comes to mind for me, Jonathan, is education. Because vouchers is really, the cover for segregation. It's a return to segregation. And as I was thinking about that, you know what I just did? I typed in the word in Google, segregation. And here's what comes up. This is from a week ago. Schools across New York are the most segregated in the United States. All right? Many school attendance zones in New York City, upstate New York, Westchester, and Long Island are similar to the 1930 redlining maps this report shows. New York State's traditional public schools are the most segregated in the nation, with children of color often shut out of coveted schools. The new report is entitled "And Stay Out." That's the title of the report, released this month by the reform nonprofit Available to All, builds off of UCLA segregation research that began in 2014. And what the new report found was that overlaps and similarities among dozens of redlining maps from 1938 match the school attendance zones in New York City, Long Island, Westchester, Albany, Buffalo. And this is not even vouchers. This is the example of public schools before they've decided to even drain public schools of some kind of opportunity. And I just thought, oh my God. And I'm fighting for public education, but I want public education that values diversity. And you and I both know that the reason why those public schools are so segregated is that if you fund public education by property taxes, and rich towns have incredibly great schools, but you can't get into a rich town because you can't afford the home in the rich town. It won't surprise you that the rich town not only has a very good school, but it probably is very white and very wealthy. And it breaks my heart because that's one of the reasons I ran for governor in 1992 was sort of to break the connection between the rich town and the good school. But look at this story coming out of New York, the most segregated public schools in the United States. Anyway, I know you want to talk about segregation. I wasn't sure if this would be a direction in which you'd like to go, but it's one that sort of touches me emotionally.
Thanks, Arnie. I think that the example is that you offered is useful for a number of reasons. One is that it reflects how formal policies that were adopted a century ago, or ish, a century-ish ago, continue to shape lived realities in the present. And so anytime we're talking about why the world is the way it is now, we have to understand decisions that were made X number of years ago and how, in different sorts of ways, that continues to shape the present. I do think it's worth noting there's quite a bit of scholarship on this that even when school resources are held constant, the racial demographics of the individuals who are at the schools lead to different evaluations of school quality. Let me put that a little bit differently, a little bit more clearly. There's interesting research where if you present white parents with pictures of the same schools and information about the schools that's all constant except for the racial identity of the students going to the schools, those white parents are more likely to view the schools that they see as whiter as being higher quality than the schools that they see, for example, as blacker, which has nothing to do with anything other than the sort of racial marker of the school. And I think that's important in part because it reflects how the way in which race is shaping education is not just a story of you have communities of color that historically were essentially trapped in particular geographic regions in which resources were sucked out of there and often redirected into areas that were only accessible to white families. But that even today, there remains deeply ingrained presumptions that associate whiteness with better in terms of public education
Right,
and
right.
blackness with worse in ways that doesn't just track contemporary inequality, which it does, but also tracks deeply held presumptions that are inconsistent with empirical reality. And so for me, I live in Somerville, in Massachusetts. Somerville has a great public school system. If you were to ask parents about the schools on the street, at least some of the parents that I meet on the street, there are presumptions made about the school in Somerville that I would want my kid to attend, not based on any deep knowledge about what is happening at any particular school, but I would say based on, relatively pervasive assumptions about which is the better school, which tracks hands down the racial identity and the socioeconomic status of who parents think are in those schools. So,
Wow.
but like you said, I did want to talk about segregation. And really, I guess in our time today, sort of want to both ask a couple questions and raise a concern I have. But no,
Right.
go ahead.
No, no. I mean, I'm just thinking about how I feel like segregation is rearing its head in ways that we don't always identify as segregation. But there was another story that I was coming out about under the SAVE Act, who can vote, all right? And we know that they want to create every impediment possible for people to exercise the franchise. But one of the things that I saw in one of the articles was that black elders without birth records could lose vote under the Save America Act because they never had them. Because they didn't either, they weren't born in a place where, they at a hospital. I mean, again, when you play it out according to who's going to get access and who's not. Once again, you can actually put a color line through the conversation and point to why will these people lose access to the franchise? Not because they're not an American citizen, not because they weren't born here. It's because they know that there is an impediment for them to actually obtain the documentation they're going to need. In addition to which, Jonathan, it's a poll tax. Because if you're going to have to replicate and find that information, there's going to be a barrier to voting, and some people won't be able to access that barrier. So I feel like every time I turn around, we are like slicing and dicing society, and the goal is to resegregate. Because if you can resegregate, then you can basically ensure that certain policies only affect one group and make sure they undermine another.
So the SAVE Act is a nice example for where I want to go. And I think that there's actually a risk in understating what's happening with the term segregation. So I do think generally it's coded or understood to capture a broader political project of racial domination. And that is sort of part of the historical white supremacist projects that have generally animated US society for the past almost 250 years. And because the problem with segregation is not just that people of different identities happen to live in different spaces, is that the segregation is either intentionally or otherwise, locking in hierarchies of citizenship. And it is, but in ways that is also meant, often by design, certainly with the Trump administration, though if not by design, in effect, that's also naturalizing that racial class hierarchy
Hmm.
because of the ways in which the inequality just gets baked in, and then we start acting like, oh, this is just how the way, this is how things work. If you work hard, you can get out of it. And so it's not that there's something structural that is both entrenching inequality in racialized ways, but it's that, it's something pathological to the communities.
Yeah.
And I mean, and the SAVE Act is a really nice example. And so you sort of describe it as a poll tax, which I've seen others describe it as. And I think that makes sense in a number of ways. One is that it's actually going to create a financial requirement on many people to actually obtain the documentation they will need to vote. Lisa Markowski out of Alaska, she was saying how like many of the American U.S. citizens in her state will just not be able to because it would require actually flying from where they live to somewhere else in order to get the uh,
Wow.
documentation that they need. But this actually, it's a different way than I was going to enter the conversation, but I think it's helpful. The purpose of the SAVE Act is to undermine self-rule. It is to entrench a particular sort of rule by elites, oligarchy, and one that is inseparable from, whether it's Christian nationalism is the term, whether it's white supremacy or white nationalism is the term. It is animated by desire to entrench a society in the United States that is structured around both racial and rigid racial and gendered hierarchy,
Right,
where
right,
everyone knows their place, and only particular people, as a function of how they are embodied, are ever able to access sites of political power that give them the ability to control the decisions that affect their lives, which is just a long way of saying it is about trying to bring the United States back to some era pre-1965,
right, right.
before we actually became a multiracial democracy. We were not before.
Hmm.
There was a little stretch in Reconstruction after the Civil War, about 17 years, where you actually had massively successful multiracial democracy and the election of Black officials across the post-Confederate South.
And nobody knows this, Jonathan.
We
I mean,
don't know.
we never are taught this. I mean, if there is a course that I regret never having taken, it's a course about what happened during Reconstruction, because we did not know. I mean, again, what it shows was success. Okay? What it shows was what was possible. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds of the child credit during the pandemic. What we knew is that we brought like 50% of children out of poverty because we cut a check. And in some ways, these are the success stories we don't tell and we don't reinforce because they ultimately undermine what the agenda is of those in power.
So, and
Oh, God.
so and this is and so part of what we're just stating, and I think I've mentioned it with you before, and I had a conversation recently with a friend where this came up, but there's a way in which we are trapped in, um, or sometimes feel trapped in this space where it feels melodramatic to use the precise terminology to describe what the current central government is attempting to do in US society, which is a nationalization of what we've seen in states like Florida and Texas and Tennessee that have, in their own ways, used fascistic sorts of policies in order to essentially exit like meaningful democratic rule
Yeah.
in by mobilizing deeply racist and transphobic rhetoric and talking points. And so what we see now in at the state level is an effort to criminalize being trans
Yeah.
in conjunction with efforts to prevent students from learning about how racism functions in US society. Neither of, and both on the one sense, we could just understand as just deeply sort of anti-democratic, hate-filled project. But it is the process of creating an identifiable other in society, of creating a permission structure to speak about that community with deeply dehumanizing rhetoric, and then to, prevent society from actually being able to gain sort of a full set of knowledge to understand what is happening, that all just describes how different sorts of fascistic regimes work.
Hmm.
We- And it's what we saw post Reconstruction in the United States. And so right now, and you really teed this up nicely, I'm going to quote a couple things in our remaining time from the introduction of a report from the African American Policy Forum that came out either the end of 2025 or the beginning of 2026. And the title of the report is Anti-Blackness is the Point, Racism, Misogyny, and Donald Trump's Assault on Equal Opportunity. And the one of the points of this report that I really think everyone should read is that the anti-blackness that has animated MAGA and DeSantis and the Trump regime, it's not just bad because it is racist, but it actually was a prerequisite for the broader dismantling of civil society in the United States. And it invokes that post-Reconstruction moment that you just
Right.
mentioned. And so I'm just going to quote. In this report, we explore four overlapping elements of the Trump regime's anti-blackness. Dot, dot, dot. Much as the self-proclaimed redeemers overturned Reconstruction in the late 19th century with a combination of racist rhetoric, policy, and historical narratives meant to rationalize it all, so too do modern-day redeemers of white male supremacy ply the same trade for the same purposes.
Hmm.
And so we see this across the board in part, and which is again just to say that the racism, the Islamophobia, the like deeply sort of patriarchal worldview that presumes that women should be in very sort of limited, constrained roles that, except for sycophants of the administration, are not going to be in any sort of position of power. All of that is part of this broader
So,
anti-democratic and yeah,
so I keep thinking about so we're constantly talking about Donald Trump and he's fascistic, and we talk about white Christian nationalism. We're talking about it all the
sure.
time, and we don't talk about Christian nationalism. We have to use the word white, and actually the word that we actually have to add is we have to add one more word, male. Okay, white male Christian nationalism, and I remember reading an article a couple of years ago that Christian nationalism is at the heart of Jim Crow America. That's the motivator. So we're going back to Reconstruction. Let's go back to Jim Crow. And you begin to see the nexus between Jim Crow America and white Christian nationalism. And as they are doing this, as your report is, this anti-blackness, the return of Jim Crow, well, that was the agenda of white Christian nationalism all along. And now white Christian nationalism has their boy in power. It's called Donald Trump and Stephen Miller. So, there we go. They planted their sword in the ground. And here's the kicker though, Jonathan. We are a nation of immigrants. There are so many others here. Think about it. I mean, in Norway, there aren't. In Sweden, there aren't. But in America, we are a country of others, of others. And then the question becomes, how do you pick? You pick because you happen to have power at the moment. And therefore, not only do you figure out who you want to otherize, but who you want to dehumanize.
And so
Oh my God.
I'm gonna agree that in many ways we are a nation of others. And when, different folks land in the United States, they then have to figure out how they navigate a racial regime that makes very clear that the closer you are to blackness, you're on the bottom, and the closer you are to whiteness,
Yes,
you're on the top. And
exactly.
that track, but we are not a nation of immigrants. There are many groups who immigrated here. There are people who were here before this was the United States,
Right,
and there were people who were kidnapped and transported here
right,
via the slave
right.
trade. And so there's many different stories that sort of shape how people arrive here. And then there's people who were able to come because they had a particular level of sort of education and just labor market attractiveness that they were drawn through different sorts of immigration policies that helps to explain why different ethnic groups in the United States face sort of different sorts of structural advantages or challenges. But so this has been a long windup. I want to read a couple quotes from a Toni Morrison essay from 1995 titled
Okay.
Racism and Fascism. And then, yeah, I'm going to have to do this quickly. The Trump administration is most generously a segregationist project,
Right.
most generously, animated by a desire to strip almost everyone in the United States of any ability to control all the decisions that affect our lives.
Exactly.
Um, and uses deeply gendered, racist, homophobic, transphobic, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic rhetoric in order to sort of push this project through. So, Toni Morrison in Racism and Fascism, 1995. Let us be reminded that before there's a final solution, there must be a first solution, a second one, even a third. The
Wow.
move toward a final solution is not a jump. It takes one step, then another, perhaps something like this. One, construct an internal enemy as both focus and diversion. Two, isolate and demonize that enemy by unleashing and protecting the utterance of overt and coded name calling and verbal abuse. Employ ad hominem attacks as legitimate charges against that enemy. Three, enlist and create sources and distributors of information who are willing to reinforce the demonization process
Jonathan Fox.
because because it is profitable, because it grants power, and because it works. So there's more there. Part of it is just to name. We're in this moment. We like there's long arc of racial fascism and authoritarianism in the United States, but we're in this sort of fascistic flare up. And the question is, do we call that out? Do we actually defend the attacks on sort of basic commitments to racial inclusion, to gender equality, to multiracial democracy? Do we identify the problem as the racial fascism or as something else? One of the problems that we've seen for the past year is that much of the response to the ways in which the Trump administration is trying to entrench racial fascism, racial authoritarianism, whatever, is by marshaling arguments that what the Trump administration is doing violates some procedure, some statutory procedure, violates First Amendment commitments to viewpoint neutrality, and contains guidance that is vague and ambiguous, but is not marshaling the argument that the problem is an attack on multiracial democracy, that the problem is that the Trump administration is violating the most fundamental equality inflected constitutional and statutory protections and values that we hold.
So let me mirror back. So you only have a minute left. So
Yeah.
what you were saying is instead of saying that, we're talking about, a First Amendment violation, or we're talking about a rule or regulation violation. So we legalize the attack when in fact it's much bigger than that, much more strategic than that. And by not talking about this level of fascism that we are seeing, that is basically is offended by this multicultural, multicolored society, we end up, going down these rabbit holes of legality, and that then avoids us talking about the bigger picture and the much more lethal one.
How can we combat racism if we don't name racism?
Thank you. All right, we got to end that way. How can we combat racism if we don't name racism? Well, that's been part of my project on this radio program has been to talking about fascism. How can we combat fascism if we don't acknowledge that's what it is? Part of the reason we've been teaching res class is how do we talk about race if we don't confront the term racism and we don't talk about it, which explains why Jonathan Feingold has been doing this with me for almost 4 years. Again, this is Race Class with Jonathan Feingold. He's a professor at BU Law School. And of course, as I reminded everyone, we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Thank you so much for doing this, Jonathan.
Thanks, Arnie.
You're welcome. This, everyone, is a Thursday edition of The Attitude. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.